Part of the whole problem is that the neoclassical economists say, turn it all over to the market. The market is the only thing you need to make correct decisions. And that's just wrong.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. On this episode, I'm going to talk to someone who is an expert in the field of energy, who's been looking at energy return on investment for several years now, is one of probably the father of this field, the analysis of energy balances. And what is energy return on investment? Well, it's an important quantity which tells you how much energy you have to put in to get energy out of a particular system. And it's a key figure of merit to determine whether or not your society is going to be flush with energy or energy poor. And this has important implications about how society can survive or thrive. As always, if you enjoy listening to this show, I appreciate if you could hit like on your podcast app, give me a share, and chat about it with your friends. And come join us at the Facebook group, The Rational View, if you have any questions or would like to chat with us. World-renowned Professor Emeritus Charles Hall has been a research scientist since 1970 and started teaching in 1972. His work has focused mainly on energy sources. As cheap, high-return energy sources start to decline, his analysis of the impacts of energy return on investment on society have gained prominence. He's interested in understanding the effects of peak oil and declining EROI on economic growth and possibilities, and how that might play out in the developing world. Many of these issues come full circle to the limits to growth arguments that emerged in the 60s and 70s. Professor Hall is an AAAS Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow Argentina, and was named one of 100 Outstanding World Scientists of 2004. He's a recipient of the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Creative Research and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Biophysical Economics. His paper with Murphy and Balog, entitled "What is the Minimum EROI that a Sustainable Society Must Have?" was featured as the 10th anniversary best paper published in the journal Energies. Professor Hall, welcome to The Rational View.
Hi.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit about your extensive career and how you got interested in energy and EROI?
Actually, I'm a biologist, and I started out just as a kid being obsessed with fish, fishing, water, anything in the water, snorkeling, mostly fishing, whatever. As long as it was water, it was fine with me. And then when I was an undergraduate at Colgate University, I discovered ecology. I mean, one guy came, somebody said to me, "What are you doing tomorrow afternoon?" And I said, I don't know, go fishing if I can. And he said, well, this guy is coming and he's going to talk on ecology. And this was 1964. And I said, ecology, what's that? And he said, well, it's about swamps. You'll like it. And so I came, and this guy was a graduate of our small college, and he was a professor at North Carolina State University. His name's Art Cooper, and he was studying energy flow out in the estuaries, the tidal lands of North Carolina. And he showed pictures of himself and his graduate students out there taking samples of fish and plants and so forth. And I was an English major at that time. And I said, I don't know what ecology is, but I'm going to become an ecologist. on that hour. And from that hour
Nice.
to this hour, my life has been a straight line, and it's been the same. So I'm always an ecologist, but the energy return on investment came from my work for my PhD. I got an undistinguished master's from Penn State on mayflies, and then I went and had this incredible experience of working with Howard Odum, who was a great ecologist, and he was a systems ecologist, and he was interested in energy. Now, most ecology is focused on the species, but he was focused on ecosystems and energy flow through ecosystems and how organisms within ecosystems use that energy. And he suggested to me, when a salmon biologist was visiting University of North Carolina, that I might be interested in looking at the energetics of salmon migration. And again, in that second, I knew what my PhD work was going to be. And so we've written that up recently, but the whole story of how this came to pass. And so I went to a beautiful creek in North Carolina called New Hope Creek in Duke Forest, although I was at UNC. And I studied the movement of fish there for 2.5 years, and every day, and I built a weir that could catch them going upstream or downstream. And I studied the productivity or the energy availability in different parts of the stream, and developed the whole concept of energy return on investment, that each fish that invested a calorie in the process of migration would return at least 5 calories by being in more productive areas at times in their life when that was more important, etc. So that's all been written up and published long ago. And
so how I got to
stuff like that. Well, in 1981, I was a young professor at Cornell University, and I had a very good undergraduate, Cutler Cleveland, and he came to me and said he wanted to work on oil, and so we thought about the work I knew of M. King Hubbard that had impressed me previously, and I said, let's redo that. And so we redid that analysis, Hubbard's analysis, from an energy perspective. And I've been working on that a lot for, the next 50 years or so of my professional life.
And that's definitely how I came in contact with your work, was through that energy return on investment analysis that you've been doing on energy sources for society. And it's how a lot of people, I'm sure, get interested in this. And it's absolutely critical now that in my opinion, that we focus on EROI to help us transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energies. So it's been fun reading your papers and looking at the reviews that you've done and others in this area. And that's how I came to find you and decided to interview you and ask you about your work and learn a little bit more about where this came from. It's very, very interesting. So what would you say is
by many business people, corporate and people in energy companies and so forth, who are just satisfied with the criteria that they're having to use for investments. It's called environmental, social, and governmental, and nobody knows what that means. So they like EROI as we apply it to different fuels, because for them it's scientific and repeatable and explicit and other good things. So, which I agree, yes.
So, I mean, tell me what you've learned from doing this over the years. What is the most surprising thing or most interesting thing?
Civilization and all these things that people attribute to technology and human ingenuity and all these kinds of things is just mostly throwing more oil at the problem. And we've, in my lifetime, our use of energy has increased by a factor of 8. And
a factor of 8.
We have all these economic theories of the left and right, and the economists like to think, oh, it's because we used this theory or that theory that the economy has been good, where it has, or that other people we've used somebody else's, the left blames the right and the right blames the left when things go wrong. But almost all of these things are directly attributable to the availability of energy at that time. And so it's amazing how people like to attribute what's going on to humans, where it's just Mother Nature, yo-yoing us around. And it will continue to be. And I guess what I fear most is that people will continue to blame political leaders or their opposition or whatever fanatic group they either are or don't like or whatever. They attribute to them whatever's going on. And you can generally understand these things very clearly from understanding the energetics at the time. Well, let me just give you an example. Margaret Thatcher was doing a terrible job, and it was very unpopular in England. And then, they brought and she was fighting with the coal miners and all this stuff. But then on her watch, they brought the North Sea oil on board. And all of a sudden, England was awash in oil, enough so they could export it. And everybody says, oh, this Margaret Thatcher's conservative perspective, how wonderful it's been for the economy of England. So therefore, let's sign up on this conservative perspective. Well, come on, she was, she happened to be at the helm when the oil was discovered, and that saved England's ass. And they did well, but except now the oil's pretty much gone, and England is having a bit of a tougher time and likely to have tougher yet. Well, let me give you another example.
So what you're...
go ahead.
Sure.
Another example is...
You're telling us that EROI is linked to economic prosperity, basically. The fact that the economy has been growing is mainly because of energy, cheap energy.
Cheap energy, you got it. And the economists have it all wrong, because in their models, they think energy is not important because it's only 5% of GDP. And labor is, 40% or whatever it is, much more. So labor must be more important because it's more money. But that's got it ass backwards, that the energy is important not because we don't spend much money on it, but because we don't spend much money on it and get a huge punch from it, a huge economic punch. It's terrific. And to give you another example, during Donald Trump's first years, the price of oil in the United States, because of this fracking, the price of oil was half the price as it was in Europe or had been in the Obama years. And so the economy was doing well. Of course it was doing well. It had cheap fuel. And, of course, the right wanted to take credit for that, and the left wanted to say something else, and whatever it is. But, it's just...
From EROI analyses, I think we're able to use these things to determine, which sources of power are good for society and which sources of power are bad. And I think that the political and public discourse hasn't caught up to a lot of these things. I think some of them have been taken to heart, like ethanol from corn, for example, as a fuel. Most of the analyses I've seen, the energy return is just
to buy it. 10% of all the gasoline we buy in the U.S. is ethanol, which just dilutes the oil and which takes which takes a joule or a calorie of fossil energy, of oil or gas, to make it, because corn is energy intensive to grow, and then to distill it, and even more that they don't count, put it in the gas tank. So it's what you say is true, but that doesn't mean that we are no longer doing it in the United States. Because corn state senators tend to turn over slowly and have a lot of power. We have a very strong agricultural representation in Congress, and so we still have to do it, even though all we get, the net we get from that is the erosion, because corn is a very erosive crop, and subsidies for farmers, which I can understand there's some virtue to that. But I just drove across the middle of the United States, and from Nebraska to Tennessee, all the fields from one edge to the other are just strictly plowed and planted with corn, without a stick for a bird to sit on or hide under. Just terribly destructive to wildlife. To have all of this corn, and then everywhere you look, you'd see these distilleries, these big steel storage things in distilleries. And I'm thinking that the whole bloody economy it's doing nothing. There's no net gain from it, because we're using all this fossil fuel to grow all of this corn and make this alcohol. And the only way we get away with doing that, or whoever gets away with it, is because of the subsidies. And any subsidy in money is a subsidy in fossil fuels. So we're subsidizing.
Because the energy, what is the energy return on an investment for ethanol from corn? Is it like 1-to-1? Is it negative?
Yeah, it's so close to 1-to-1 you can't really tell. I have a paper. I'll send you the paper. Other people have come to the same conclusion. And, there's some small differences depending on whether you include the pig food you can get out of it or not. And but it's so close to 1-to-1. And you don't need 1-to-1 to run the society. We guess that we have several papers on this. You want all these papers? I'll send them all. We have several papers indicated you need something like 10-to-1, 12-to-1 to have anything like modern American, including Canadian, society. To have anything like the affluence that we have, you need to have high EROI fuels.
That's interesting. I'd like to explore that a little bit. You put out a paper, a famous paper with Murphy and Balog, which was the first attempt to establish a minimum EROI for a sustainable society. Yeah. Can you describe your thesis to our listeners?
Yeah, that was actually, it was a good idea, but it's slightly mislabeled, because we didn't figure it out for running society. We just sort of figured out for what you would need to use a liter of fuel. In other words, we said, if you're going to drive a truck, what do you need to get the oil out of the ground, to refine it, to distribute it to where you use it, and to make the infrastructure, the roads and bridges and stuff, that you need to do this? And, because Steve Below really knew his stuff on this, we got, I think, pretty good numbers on all this. And concluded just to drive a truck was 3-to-1. Now, in a later paper, we said, but what happens if you want to put something in the truck? So if you want to grow corn and put it in the truck, something, economically useful. And that intelligent guesses figured would be around 5-to-1. But then we thought, well, what about taking care of the families, feeding the families of the workers, and in a sense replacing the workers, just as we had figured out what it cost to replace the machinery as it wore out. And so we did this, how much to support the families, and then to do health care and education and maybe some arts and so forth. And pretty soon we got up to 10 to 12 to 1 as an intelligent guess as to what we need to support anything like modern society. And 12 to 1, you know, the main, you asked earlier, what I had learned from this, the main thing I learned is that the EROI of our major fossil fuels is declining. The first thing I learned was how important it was for us for oil and fossil fuels in our history. And the second is that they're all declining. And this we found in our first paper in 1981, and then we looked at it.
Why are they declining? Why are oil and fossil fuels declining in the energy that they return to society?
Using up the best stuff. You know, the geologists are no fools. They find the biggest resources that are easiest or cheapest to recover, and most of our oil today, or more than half, comes from just 400 big fields. Many in the Middle East, of course, and we're just pumping them out. And as you pump them out, you what's called the water cut increases. You have to spend more and more energy pumping up water that you just then try to get rid of, hopefully in a non-polluting way. And so it's called depletion.
So
in EROI, in a certain
So what are we down to now
well,
with fossil fuels?
Technology will take care of that, but that's not true. Technology is operating and it does positive things, but EROI is a balance between depletion and technology. And everywhere we look, the EROI of our fossil fuels is declining as we use up the best stuff. And in economics, they talked about it in 1830 with Ricardo. And I mean, it's a fundamental principle of economics that they don't talk about today. Basically,
so we're using up the best oil. It's starting to dip down.
Basically, I think the conventional economics that we are teaching our young people is a house of cards. I would use stronger words, but it's not polite. But it begins with B, and the next letter is U. And so I think that we're teaching young people a whole suite of fairy tales. Now, we have a whole different, it's called Energy and the Wealth of Nations. And an introduction to biophysical economics by myself and my colleague Ken Klitgard. And this has reviews conventional economics, discusses what's wrong with it, and gives the alternative, what we call biophysical economics. And the concept is simply this. Concept, I'm a natural scientist. I'm trained in physics and chemistry and biology and geology and meteorology and, you know, all that physical natural sciences. Economics, as is conventionally taught, is a social science. It's taught only from the perspective of human wants and needs and the ability of markets to supply this. And it starts with markets, but, you know, where does stuff in the markets come from? It comes from the earth. It comes from energy used, applied to copper deposits, which are declining as we mine out the best and best copper and so forth. Just to give you an example, we're trying to figure out what would be the impact of going to electric automobiles at anything like the rate we're doing regular automobiles. Electric cars have about 3 times more copper in them than does a conventional automobile. And so we're asking, so this is a biophysical question. If we are going to make 1 billion cars, as some people say, electric cars, and run them on wind turbines, which is a possibility, is there possibly enough copper to do that? Doesn't look very good at our first cut analysis.
Really?
So
Interesting.
They're assuming, the economists assume, well, there's not enough copper will raise the price, and some people will find it. But, as you keep raising the price, the grade goes down, and it takes more and more energy to get the next kilogram of copper. And if you're talking about all the copper you need for your wind turbines, plus all the copper you need for these electric cars, plus their charging stations and all the rest of it, it gets really scary. And, no way in hell, actually. No way, as I can see.
Then you have to do transmission from offshore wind fields to the mainland and distribute all this electricity.
You got the idea.
I can see the problem. Your analysis of what we need for society is 10 to 1, 12 to 1 to support our current standard of living, I guess is what you would say. Is that fair?
Pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, we're talking about basic ERI, energy in to energy out, or are we talking about
energy out over energy in? It's a ratio.
Because there's a lot of different EROIs. If you look in the literature, people have written there's extended EROI, where you consider more things, like the transport of the fuel to the user as a cost. But you're talking basically basic EROI in this equation that you're looking at.
I mean, some of these papers I think are really good. The people that are in London, Brockway and his Brockway and King did a paper I thought was good. Although I introduced the concept of extended EROI, or I think I call it, Dave Murphy and I call it EROI POU, point of use. I wish that I hadn't.
Yes.
Because EROI should be getting the energy from nature. And it's a separate question to ask what's the distribution and issues of quality and so forth. I mean, you've got to start with what's it cost to get it from nature. I think that's a critical question. But, I'm the one who brought it up in a paper in 2011, so it's okay. And, I like very much the work that Brockway does. I mean, his group at Leeds is really good. So, okay, I'm not going to make a stink about that.
Your 2014 paper with Lambert and Balow shows what I would consider a famous graph of EROI from various energy sources. And you have hydro at 84 to 1. You have nuclear at 14 to 1, wind at 19 to 1, solar at 10 to 1. Mm-hmm. Did these analyses compare basic EROI, or because I've looked into the literature for solar and wind, and there you
what we call the mine mouth, or at the wellhead or the farm gate. At the edge of the entity that's winning the energy from nature. Yes, they're all the same.
Many of the solar and wind papers that I've looked at give themselves a quality factor improvement, where they multiply their energy by a factor of 3 to say that they're offsetting coal. That's not basic EROI, obviously. They call it primary energy equivalent.
I don't have a problem with that. It's sort of. First of all, you have to state it clearly, which they often do not. But, there's some people who do this well. Marco Rauge, for example, does it well, generally. But you have to be very explicit that you're doing this. And you also have to make some further adjustments, because it only works for electricity that's being used for these high-quality functions. If you're using electricity to run a motor, which is more efficient than an internal combustion engine, then then it's electricity that's using its quality, or to run a computer or a light or something like that. But if you're using electricity for resistance heating, to heat a room or heat water, which I don't know what, 20 or 30% of all electricity is used to do that. Well, you shouldn't give it a quality function to do a low quality job. It's a little tricky, but it gets a lot trickier if you're talking about what happens if you penetrate a lot more electricity, meaning if the wind turbine or photovoltaic energy becomes 30 or 50 or God knows 100% of society, then you're using the electricity mostly for things that its quality is not important, and sometimes even not useful, such as certain metallurgical, depending what it is, but certain metallurgical uses and so forth. To assess this properly, you have to do a much more comprehensive assessment. But the most interesting work, in my opinion, that has been done on this is by a Spaniard named Capellan Perez and his colleagues at the University of Valladolid. I don't know exactly how to say it in Spain. And it's really good, because he says if you make a transformation to 50 or 100% renewables, then the EROI will drop down as low in his models, which I can't find any fault with, to 4-to-1 or even 2-to-1, because of a number of things. The inherently lower EROI of many of these solar things, the increasing energy intensity of things like copper as you use more and more of it, and what's perhaps most important is that the energy invested in renewable has to be upfront. So during the time period that you're investing, you're building the infrastructure of wind turbines or whatever, your energy use is enormous. Well, I'll send you the paper, and this can be made available. You know, any of your listeners, if they want, my email is chall, CHALL, at esf.edu, chall@esf.edu. And if you don't write me an enormous email, I'd be very happy to answer your questions, if I can.
Excellent. That's great. Are you on the internet much? Do you have a Facebook presence?
Barely. I have lots of. I'm trying to organize that now in this new institute we have, so that it's more accessible than it is. But if you go to this thing, www.bpeinstitute, all one word, bpeinstitute.org, then you can get a link to a lot of stuff. You know,
that sounds very interesting.
Go buy my book. It's all in here.
There we go. $108. And that's energy and the wealth of nations.
Wealth of nations. You know, that's a pun on Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. The first economist, Adam Smith, who by the way, was pretty close to a biophysical economist himself, as was Ricardo and even Karl Marx. If you pushed them, they understood the importance of energy, as did the people who came before them. It was the people, Menges and Jevons and stuff, who came up with this idea of marginal economics that, in my opinion, started the great downhill journey of conventional economics.
Before I go away from this EROI of various power sources, you made a very important point there. As renewables become, Perez says, as renewables become a higher proportion of our grid, you now have to stop using the primary energy equivalent EROI and degrade back to the basic EROI for these things, which effectively divides by 3 those numbers that you presented originally. And so the wind would go down to 6-1, and the solar would go down to 3-1, effectively.
There's a paper by DuPont.
And that's
gives somewhat lower numbers because I think she does a more comprehensive analysis than the original numbers by Kubachevsky that were roughly 20-1. I thought the EROI from wind was getting more and more because as you make them higher, you intercept more wind. The wind goes up exponentially as you go up in elevation. But
right.
According to DuPont, that doesn't seem to be as important as I thought. Yeah, basically.
Interesting. I'll have to take a look at that too.
Basically, it's criminal. The U.S. Department of Energy or the Canadian Department of whatever you have up there, they ought to be in the business of funding large-scale national labs or programs of the highest integrity, and that's really important, the highest integrity and objectivity, to be examining the stuff and mostly to maintain the data. In the United States, we don't even maintain the data anymore. So you can't make EROI evaluations. Canadians, I don't know, Statistics Canada, some good things about it, and you guys do what's called I/O analysis, and that's good. We don't do that, and we should be having 100 or 1,000 PhDs studying this stuff, and they're going to find some things wrong with our preliminary estimates. I don't think very wrong, but you need to have it out there. You need to have it peer reviewed. You have to have a big problem increasingly in science is people are using science to defend positions rather than to test hypotheses. Science is not meant to defend a position. Science is meant to test hypotheses. And so there's all kinds of things that are essentially criminal in how our governments are not taking the ball. And part of the whole problem is that the neoclassical economists say, turn it all over to the market. The market is the only thing you need to make correct decisions. And that's just wrong. And so the market can't look forward. The market can't look to the future of copper. It can't look to the future of petroleum. I'm working with a Frenchman named Jean Larrère, who knows more about oil than anybody else, and we're trying to write a paper on the future of oil, and it seems pretty clear that we really have only about half as much oil as the official estimates from the U.S. Energy Information Agency or the other things are, and the reasons why are very clear. The world is being told a fantasy. We may have only 10 or 15 years of abundant oil left. By abundant, I mean less than $10 a gallon.
And I mean, that's good for the environment, I guess, in some ways, knowing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. What would a society look like with a power source of EROI of 5 or 3? What does that society look like?
England in 1500. Kerry King, my colleague Kerry King, who thinks about this in many good ways, has written a paper in 2015 about, he took some data on the economy of England from 1300s till 1750, about somewhere between a third and a half of all economic activity was to get the fuel. That is the firewood, the fodder, and the food, because human labor was a lot of the work back then. About a third to a half of all the economic activity was used to get the energy to run that section of the economy plus the other half. Then with the discovery of coal, which is so much more concentrated than grass or wood. In the 1750s, it started to go up to or down to only 25% or so of the economy was used to get the energy to run that section of the economy plus the other 75%. And then with oil, it went down to somewhere between 5 and 10%, and we became rich. The world is enormously rich now, very poorly distributed, very poorly distributed, but the world is so rich compared to England in 1500. Now, of course, we've got a problem in that, we got 20 or whatever times more people. And I think the problems we don't understand very well are social. Because when things get tight, when economics gets tight, then, as I said, people will blame other political groups. They'll look for crazy ideas from the left and the right to try to get us back to the good old days. Well, excuse me, the good old days are gone. And we've used up that oil, and now we're going to have to adapt. If we make a transition to wind turbines and photovoltaics, we can do it, but my guess is we'll be a lot poorer. Now, is that wrong? Is that bad? Well, look at Europe now. I mean, good Lord, in the future, will we be able to rebuild these huge areas that are destroyed by floods? That's a huge energy investment. And I look at the waste of all of those splinters of what used to be buildings and stuff, and all those cars that are destroyed and stuff. Well, will we even be able to replace that wealth? So these
the one thing we haven't looked at.
Nobody is talking about. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about any restriction on our economic well-being. Every generation is supposed to be better off than it was in the past. Well, we could when we were growing exponentially with our use of oil. But doing it now is not easy at all. And it's not just that the oil is, the energy return on investment for oil and coal and whatever is going way down, is that everything else is requiring more energy. Agriculture, in some respects, certainly getting metals and maintaining healthy water supplies, on and on.
The one thing we haven't talked about yet is nuclear, and that's something that I've looked into, and I believe, based on the numbers and the science, that you stated that it was 14-1 in an EROI based on earlier data, meta-analysis of, I think, Lenzen's work in 2008, where he went through a whole bunch of papers and got all the EROI estimates from the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and threw them all together to get an average.
And it's, again, many of the analyses are used for people who are advocates one way or the other, as opposed to people who are testing hypotheses. But anyway, I don't know what it is, but, the price of a new nuclear plant in the United States has increased dramatically. And if that price is reflecting in some way, as I believe it is, EROI, I don't know what it is, but, my guess is, okay, nuclear is probably 5 to 15-1. It's not bad. There's all kinds of new ideas about smaller units. Two things worry me. Safety a little bit. Most of the accidents have been stupid. Like the Japanese, I can't believe it, where the word tsunami comes from, didn't put their backup generators on the roof. So the backup generators got hit by the tsunami. It's crazy. And all kinds of just stupid things. Not that I'm implying Japanese engineers are stupid. They're among the best in the world. But this particular case, In
that
every
particular
one of
case was a bit of a...
It's taken place, Chernobyl, 2 Mile Island, and in Japan, it's been a different issue that's caused the problem. So it's hard to predict. There's thorium reactors, which are inherently safe. You can't make bombs from them. But we have people. A lot of people don't know this. We tried thorium back at Oak Ridge a long time ago, and they had some huge engineering problems. There's now talk about smaller units that you can bury in the ground, and if everything goes wrong, you can walk away from them, and the earth can dissipate the heat. That's a good idea. But if you're talking about making a difference with nuclear, you've got to talk about doing it around the world, and to have nuclear technology taught around the world with all of these conflicting political things, that's really scary to me. And it doesn't have to be a nuclear bomb, just somebody gets some plutonium and puts it in a boat and sails it into a big harbor and blows it up with TNT or ammonium nitrate, and that would be really nasty. And once you have a really big nuclear accident, people will call for shutting it down, and then we wasted that huge amount of energy we put into building the nuclear. So I think we should probably go with wind turbines and photovoltaics carefully. The main thing I think we need to do is restrict growth of human population, which is happening in some places as we give women alternatives with what to do with their lives besides being barefoot and pregnant. And I think it's important to have, I don't think we can have indefinite economic growth. There are people who call Herman Daly long ago steady state economy, and people who call for degrowth, and I'm all for all of them, but I think that it's going to happen whatever you plan. That I think there will be increasingly constrictions in what humans can do economically as we use up the best resources. And that, people don't understand it. The fracking saved the United States' ass and made a huge difference by all the oil that we produce from fracking. But it's only 2 decades, and now we've used up all the best fracking sites. And they're trying to do infill drilling and other crazy things, and it's just not working. So
fracking also leaks methane into the atmosphere, which exacerbates the CO2 impact of the burning of the carbon.
Yeah, sure.
But looking at the nuclear, you had a 14-to-1 estimate from your paper, and someone went back and reanalyzed Lenzen's work and said, well, okay, 14-to-1 seems low. All of the analyses from the 70s and 80s, if you average them, are less than 10 in terms of the EROI.
Yeah.
If you average the ones after the 80s, it's 30-to-1 because of the new processes that they have for fuel enrichment.
Are they using this 3-to-1 multiplier? Check.
No, not for nuclear. It's a thermal source, obviously. So 30-to-1 is at the primary energy, or at the basic energy level.
I don't know. I'm not in a position to evaluate that, and you may be right. And so, but you got to remember.
And you're right. The cost.
EROI is an important, but not the only criteria to make a decision amongst different things. Officially have no position pro or anti-nuclear. I'm open to that. I was enthusiastic about nuclear for a long time, but the proliferation thing is scary to me. I've worked at Brookhaven National Lab and Oak Ridge National Lab. I've worked at nuclear labs. I'm pretty familiar with all the technology and stuff. And I've never worried about working at a lab full of radioactive materials. It's just because it can be well managed. But I don't like the idea of proliferation. Good Lord, all the things that are stored in Russia and the United States on the top of missiles, that's, oh my God. Not a nice idea to think about that.
Yeah, that's a bad place to put that stuff on the top of missiles. It definitely should be in a reactor vessel, in my opinion.
The nuclear warheads to running nuclear reactors. I'm all for that. That's a good idea.
But looking at the situation, we have, I guess, a choice of going back to an EROI of 5-to-1 or maintaining an EROI of 20-30-to-1 with nuclear. And I think a lot of people are struggling with that choice. There's the politics of where you need to go to decouple this. Obviously, people have worries, as you say, about proliferation. People are scared about, nuclear spills or radiation getting into the environment. But in my opinion, looking at it, we've seen Chernobyl, the worst possible accident you can have with a nuclear reactor and one of these old designs, and it's now a nature reserve. Very few people have been killed by these nuclear accidents. Greenpeace will tell you millions of people.
In the United States, for every nuclear plant, every year you ran a nuclear plant, 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, instead of a 1,000 watt coal plant, which was basically the choice for a long time. About 10 people were not killed. There were 5 or 6 people not killed by emphysema, 4 people not killed in the coal mines, and 1 person not killed at the railroad crossing or something. I mean, and these were good numbers.
Wow. Is there an additional cost that we should be considering when comparing power sources for providing on-demand power versus intermittent power?
Yeah. I mean, ask people in California. I've spent some time talking with the guy who designs the systems for distributing power in California, and they're going bonkers because they built so much photovoltaic that they get these huge peaks in the middle of the day, and then it drops off to 0 by 6 when power demand is greatest. So you have to go from oversupply at noon from the PVs to no power from solar at all. So you've got to have something you can ramp up as that power supply. And it's so much electricity coming in from PV in the middle of the day that it's melting transformers and causing all kinds of problems. The net effect of which is that California is importing, according to this guy, is importing all kinds of really dirty electricity from Mexico, made with coal or dirty oil. And probably putting in the PVs has caused all kinds of environmental problems that are not dealt with very well in their regulations or their evaluations. So there you have it. Yeah, and the wind, when we looked at wind turbines in upstate New York, where I used to live, there'd be 2 weeks every summer when the wind didn't blow a whiff. And what do you do? Now, the best thing you can do is to store water when the wind's blowing and then let the water go. But here in Montana, I live in Montana.
Pumped hydro storage, yeah.
I used to work on the impacts of greatly changing water discharge levels on the bugs, the insects, and the fish in the Montana rivers, and it was a pretty serious problem. So there's all kinds of issues that you need to deal with here.
There seems to be more people breaking dams than building dams right now.
Oh yeah,
to free fish, salmon spawning grounds and that sort of thing, right?
I started studying fish. Remain an environmentalist. I remain an environmentalist. I'm all for oil, actually. I think oil is a terrific fuel, but we have to use it wisely and slowly. And everything we use to accelerate the economy is accelerating our depletion of oil. And so I'm running for president. Please vote for me. And I want to restrict the economy, and I want to have 10% less wealth next year so that your children will have some. And the stupidest thing is we're using natural gas when we could be using coal to make electricity, and our grandchildren our grandchildren probably be really angry at us for having used this natural gas, which they'll be desperate for, to make fertilizer. That's how you make nitrogen fertilizer from natural gas. And we're going to use it up just to make electricity when they're going to need it to eat. That's not, so in a certain sense,
burning this stuff is a really bad choice.
to replacing coal with natural gas. At least I want to think about the whole system. Was trained as a systems biologist, a systems ecologist, trained to try to think about the whole thing. And we're just single issue, like you're single issue nuclear. We got to get you off that wagon. And so I apologize if I insulted you, but anyway, I think that's we have to bring systems thinking, thorough, good, objective energy analysis into the fold, and you know, we can do it. I could do it. I could train good people to do that in 3 or 5 years. But we're not even training them anymore. We don't have young people. When I'm dead, and if John Day's dead, and a few of us are dead, there's not going to be too many replacements.
I think I prefer the trade with the proliferation risk and the 30-to-1 EROI to the England in the 1500s. But that's the choice that we're forced to make, I think.
Maybe.
Is do we want to take these risks?
Well,
I think we're getting to the end of our time slot here. So I think we're going to wrap this up.
Okay.
But I really appreciate you coming to chat with us on The Rational View, and I love talking with you. A lot of interesting stories, and great to hear your perspective on these things. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and hope lots of people listen to this.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.